Some cities are remembered because they endured. Others are remembered because they vanished. But in 1893, something stranger happened in Chicago. On the edge of Lake Michigan, in less than 3 years, they raised what looked like an imperial capital from another age. A shining metropolis of domes, colonnades, lagoons, statues, arches, and electric lights so dazzling that people who stepped inside it felt they had crossed into a civilization far older and grander than the America they knew. Then, almost as quickly as it appeared, it was destroyed, burned, dismantled, abandoned, erased. And the deeper you look at what they called the White City, the harder it becomes to believe this was just a temporary fairground built from plaster and wood. Before we go further, if you're drawn to the forgotten corners of history, where the official story starts to wobble, subscribe now and stay with me until the end, because what begins as a World's Fair may turn into something much harder to explain. In 1893, they built a city inside a city, 630 acres along the south side of Chicago, beside the water, with canals, bridges, plazas, gardens, internal transport, power systems, water lines, sewage, roads, and monumental architecture on a scale that should have taken far longer than anyone admits. There were around 200 major structures and auxiliary buildings spread across the grounds, all arranged with such symmetry and theatrical precision that visitors described the experience in almost religious terms. The facades were so bright they seemed unreal in daylight, and at night the whole place glowed with electric illumination at a scale most Americans had never witnessed before. For many visitors, it was their first encounter with a fully electrified dreamscape, and the effect was not simply impressive, it was disorienting. They called it the White City, officially part of the world's Columbian Exposition, staged to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, though even that anniversary was already offset by a year. Chicago won the right to host the fair in 1890, defeating rival cities with less than 3 years before opening day. That part of the story is straightforward. What is not straightforward is what came next. From a muddy lakeshore and swampy terrain, they supposedly created an immense classical metropolis by the 1st of May 1893, complete with a court of honor that looked less like an exhibition and more like the ceremonial center of an empire. Daniel Burnham oversaw the project. Frederick Law Olmsted handled the landscape. Prominent architectural firms designed the major buildings. Those are the names history gives you, and they matter. But names are not explanations. They tell you who signed drawings and chaired committees. They do not tell you how, in approximately 26 months, an industrial nation still deeply dependent on horse-drawn transport, manual labor, rudimentary lifting systems, and fragmented building logistics produced a site that, even in photographs, reads more like inherited civilization than temporary construction. The official answer is always the same. The buildings were not marble. They were not carved stone. They were not ancient. They were made from a material called staff, essentially a mix of plaster, cement, and fiber, applied over wooden or metal framing. It was lightweight, cheap, and fast to work with. That is the explanation you are given for everything. The speed, the scale, the ornament, the illusion of permanence. And at first glance, it sounds reasonable. It is practical. It is efficient. It solves the puzzle before the puzzle has time to grow. But then you start studying the photographs, not glancing at them as museum curiosities, but actually studying them. You look at the columns rising over crowds of tiny figures in hats and long coats. You look at the depth of the relief work on the facades, at the repeating sculptural programs, the pediments, balustrades, cornices, domes, and vaults. You look at the way the great masses sit, in proportion to each other, the control of perspective along the basin, the hierarchy of heights, the disciplined spacing of monumental forms. You begin to notice that even if a building is technically temporary, it still has to be designed, framed, surfaced, finished, transported into existence, and coordinated with the surrounding whole. And the White City was not one convincing illusion. It was hundreds of them, working together at once, across an enormous site. The largest building, the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, covered around 30 acres and enclosed one of the vastest interior spaces on Earth at the time. It contained acres upon acres of exhibits beneath a single roof, a structure so large that comparisons quickly became absurd. One temporary exhibition hall, completed in less than 2 years, using methods that were already outdated by the standards people casually assume must have existed. Even if one grants the official material explanation completely, the logistics alone should stop you cold. This was not a decorated facade hiding nothing. It was a functioning environment of colossal scale. And then there was the agriculture building with its giant dome. The transportation building designed by Louis Sullivan with its celebrated polychrome entrance arch. The electricity building, the administration building, the machinery hall, the mines and mining building, the woman's building, and the great Palace of Fine Arts. All of them different, all of them heavily ornamented, all of them inserted into a coherent visual order that made the fair feel less like a cluster of pavilions and more like a complete ceremonial capital. That is what unsettled so many people who saw it. Not just that it was beautiful, but that it carried the emotional weight of something established, something with historical gravity. Visitors often struggled to describe the experience because the architecture did not feel provisional. It felt authoritative. It felt like the physical proof of a civilization at its peak, and yet everyone was told it had just risen from the ground in a rush. The fair drew roughly 27 million visits in just 6 months. Think about what that means in the context of the 1890s. People came from across the United States and from abroad. They arrived by rail and boat. They walked through avenues of whiteness, crossed bridges, entered courts framed by domes and statuary, and encountered a level of urban pageantry that many of them had never imagined could exist in America. Reports from the time dwell on astonishment. Some emphasize the lights, some the scale, some the beauty. But underneath all of that was a quieter reaction, the one that lingers longest when you read personal recollections. A sense that this place did not feel new. That detail appears again and again in later memory. People who had seen the fair as children sometimes described it, decades later, not as a carnival or exposition, but as something older than themselves, almost impossible to place in time. One remembered asking who had built all of it and not being satisfied by the answer he received. That feeling matters, not because memory is perfect, but because memory preserves emotional truth even when factual details blur. And the emotional truth repeated by many witnesses was that the White City felt discovered as much as built. Now set that feeling beside the timeline. Ground was broken in 1891. The Exposition opened in May 1893. In that interval, crews graded land, drove piles, constructed waterways and lagoons, installed utilities, built roads, assembled rail connections, coordinated exhibitors, completed enormous halls, surfaced vast facades, installed sculpture, and prepared the site for millions of visitors. Whenever people try to defend the speed by saying 19th century labor was abundant and discipline was stronger, they miss the actual scale of the challenge. Labor can multiply effort. It does not erase complexity. It does not make geometry, ornament, scheduling, materials, weather, transport, and finishing cease to exist. And the White City was not an isolated case. That is where the question deepens. Chicago was part of a pattern. Late 19th and early 20th century World's Fairs repeatedly unveiled enormous classical and beaux-arts environments of seemingly impossible completeness. Paris in 1889, Buffalo in 1901, St. Louis in 1904, San Francisco in 1915. Again and again, whole dream cities appeared for a season, complete with monumental composition and overwhelming decorative density, then disappeared. Officially, the same logic applies each time. Temporary materials, temporary purpose, temporary destiny. Build fast, impress the world, tear it down. But repetition does not weaken the mystery. It strengthens it, because a one-time anomaly can be dismissed as an extraordinary exertion. A repeating pattern across multiple cities and exhibitions begins to look like a ritual of display and erasure. Entire environments were raised, celebrated, photographed, and removed with remarkable efficiency, leaving behind only selected remnants and the narrative that nothing there was ever meant to last. That would be less intriguing if the surviving images looked flimsy. They do not. This is where the Palace of Fine Arts becomes so important. It is the great exception that refuses to sit quietly inside the official frame. Today it survives as the Museum of Science and Industry, though heavily rebuilt and modified. Unlike most of the fair's gleaming structures, it was designed with more durable materials because it housed valuable artworks that required protection. That is the conventional explanation. But the moment one building in a supposedly temporary city must be made truly fire-resistant and structurally permanent, questions begin to multiply. If the Exposition was only ever a short-lived plaster dream, why does one of its central monuments receive the treatment of an enduring institution? Why is permanence selectively introduced into a city whose myth depends on impermanence? And then came the fires. In January 1894, fire ripped through several of the remaining structures. Later that year, another major blaze consumed the manufacturer's building. Within a remarkably short span, some of the most astonishing architecture in the United States had been turned into debris, ash, salvage, or nothing at all. By the mid-1890s, the fairgrounds had largely lost the visual spell that had captivated millions. What remained most clearly were photographs, descriptions, promotional images, engineering notes, and the uneasy aftertaste left by disappearance itself. And disappearance changes how people look. If the White City had survived intact, it might have been normalized by familiarity. People would have learned its materials, studied its flaws, traced its compromises, and settled into comfortable certainty. But because it vanished so quickly, the photographs gained power. They became evidence without context, grandeur severed from process. We are left staring at images of immense architecture while being told not to ask too many questions about how such a thing came together so fast, why it looks the way it does, or why the broader fair tradition kept repeating the same astonishing formula. Of course, there are explanations. Some historians emphasize industrial organization, prefabrication, centralized planning, large labor forces, and the deceptive power of staff coding to mimic stone. All of that is worth taking seriously, but even serious explanations do not dissolve the deeper discomfort. Because the issue is not whether one ornamental surface can be faked. The issue is whether an entire urban vision of this scale, consistency, and emotional force can be reduced to the phrase temporary plaster. At some point, the explanation starts sounding less like understanding and more like a spell meant to end inquiry. Look again at the White City at night. The reflected light in the water, the glowing facades, the domes standing above the basin like they belong to a civilization announcing itself to the modern age. The fair is often remembered as a triumph of American ambition, and it was that, but ambition is not the whole story. What people encountered there was also an architecture of memory, an architecture that seemed to arrive already loaded with cultural authority. Greece, Rome, Renaissance monumentalism, imperial planning, sacred geometry, ceremonial procession, all condensed into a temporary city on the shore of a still-growing American metropolis. That is why the White City continues to trouble people who look at it closely. Not because there is one secret fact that solves everything, but because every accepted answer seems thinner than the photographs it tries to explain. The official record tells you what the fair was supposed to be. The images suggest something larger, not necessarily ancient in the literal sense, not necessarily inherited from some lost civilization, but certainly stranger than the neat summary repeated in textbooks. A city built to appear eternal, unveiled to millions, then removed before familiarity could strip away its myth. And maybe that is the real key. Not that the White City was impossible, but that it was meant to operate at the edge of believability, meant to overwhelm, meant to establish a visual claim about power, order, progress, and destiny. Meant to persuade ordinary people that modern America could summon whole worlds into existence and discard them at will. If so, then the architecture was not just decoration, it was theater on a civilizational scale. Still, the question remains. When you stand the timeline beside the imagery, when you compare the labor methods to the finished surfaces, when you remember how many buildings rose at once and how quickly they disappeared, something refuses to settle. The White City keeps producing the same reaction in every generation of observers, willing to look for longer than a moment. Amazement first, then doubt, then the uneasy suspicion that history has told the story in a way that is technically sufficient but emotionally false. Because what stood in Chicago in 1893 does not feel like a fairground. It feels like a revelation, A glimpse of a parallel version of the modern world, one in which beauty, scale, and symbolic power were marshaled with such intensity that the result still looks unreal more than a century later. And perhaps that is why it had to vanish so completely, not merely because temporary structures decay, but because some spectacles are easier to control as memory than as physical fact. What was the White City really? A masterpiece of temporary architecture? A feat of organization so extreme it still strains credibility? A deliberate illusion designed to create the feeling of ancient permanence in a nation still inventing itself? Perhaps all of those at once. But whatever answer you choose, the photographs remain. Silent, brilliant, impossible looking. And they continue to ask the same question they asked the first stunned visitors who stepped beneath those domes and colonnades on the shore of Lake Michigan. If this was only temporary, why does it look like something the world was never supposed to forget?